The Tonight Show stage shimmered under spotlights as Johnny Carson leaned into the camera, cue card in hand and a grin playing on his lips. Elvis is back on stage again. His sixth comeback, if anyone's counting, he quipped, voice rich with amused disdain. I guess he only resurfaces when his jumpsuits survive the laundry. Laughter thundered through the studio, bouncing off the velour curtains. Carson raised an eyebrow, savoring the moment. Back in the control room, a dozen sound engineers hunched over mixing boards, fingers frozen on faders. The usual roar of applause died on their lips as one technician whispered, half to himself, half into the hum of cables. His little girl's watching this at home. A few miles away, in a hushed hotel ballroom, Elvis Presley had just wrapped a private rehearsal. Guitar in hand, he'd been exploring new arrangements far removed from the Vegas glitz. When his road manager slipped him a cassette, NBC, February 12th, it read, Elvis pressed play. Carson's laughter crackled through the speakers, followed by the Tonight Show theme fading back in. Elvis absorbed every punchline, every inflection, without flinching. He didn't curse the tape. He didn't storm off. Instead, he sat in silence, fingers tapping an unhurried rhythm on the mahogany table. Each tap was a heartbeat. Each pause, a question. How do you answer a barb that strikes at your child, rather than your ego? The question hung between the pastel drapes and the crease of his jumpsuit's fading sequins. And then, without a word, Elvis looked up, dark eyes steady, determination hardening behind them. He reached across the table and tapped out a simple message on his notepad. February 12th, NBC. That silent gesture set in motion what would soon be known as Elvis's quietest showdown. No angry calls, no public denouncements, just a measured, unspoken resolve to step onto that very stage and respond, on his terms, in his own way, to protect the dignity of a father rather than feed the taunts of a comedian. And so, the king prepared to turn a joke into a reckoning, using neither fury nor flourish, but the power of his quietest voice. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The moment the studio audience's laughter faded into the final commercial break, a peculiar hush fell over the control room at NBC. Rows of sound engineers sat frozen, headphones askew, eyes wide behind flickering monitors. On the giant reel-to-reel recorder in the corner, the tape clicked over to a fresh spool. A young engineer, eyes as round as the meters on the mixing console, nudged his colleague and whispered, "His daughter's watching this at home." In the vast Tonight Show studio down the hall, Johnny Carson leaned back in his high-backed chair, feigning apathy. Across the desk lay the cue cards. Elvis returns, sixth comeback. Costume laundry crisis? He smiled into the red glow of the camera light and delivered the punchline that would send ripples through two worlds. Well, it looks like Elvis is back on stage again, his sixth comeback, if anyone's counting. Maybe after all those rhinestones, he finally had to run them through the wash. The audience erupted. Laughter thundered like raw applause, bouncing off the velour drapes. But behind the grin on Carson's face was a calculated precision. He struck the perfect blend of jest and jibe. After all, poking at the king was a guaranteed ratings grab. Yet somewhere in Los Angeles that night, just a few blocks away, in a quiet hotel rehearsal room, Elvis Presley was finishing a private run-through of his newest arrangements. The hotel suite, dimly lit by a single floor lamp and fringed with heavy velvet drapes, served as his sanctum between sold-out Vegas dates. A battered Fender guitar rested against the chaise lounge. A Steinway upright piano stood sentinel by the fireplace. He'd been humming through a deeply personal ballad, fingers tapping out its rhythm against the edge of a walnut coffee table, when his road manager handed him a cassette tape. Elvis took the tape without expression. His dark eyes, rimmed with fatigue from weeks on the road, gave nothing away. He inserted the tape into the small boombox on the mantel, punched play, and cradled the receiver to his ear. In the stark silence that followed, Johnny Carson's laughter curled through the speakers, the same laughter that had filled the NBC control room. Elvis's jaw clenched. He ran a hand through the hair, still damp from a midday shower, the back of his neck prickling with a familiar mix of irritation and something deeper, more paternal. He was thinking of his 8-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie, settling in at home with her mother, tuning in as a proud child might. He could see her tiny face, eyes bright with adoration for her father, an image that made Carson's words sting sharply. Elvis didn't curse into the recorder. He didn't slam the tape off. Instead, he let the jingle of The Tonight Show's theme linger on the edge of silence. Then, without a word, he reached over the coffee table and began tapping out a steady beat with his fingertips, first a slow heartbeat, then a deliberate cadence that grew in confidence. It was the rhythm of resolve, the pulse of a quiet promise. In the corner, his Memphis Mafia friends watched: Alan Fortas, Joe Esposito, Marty Lacker, men who had stood by him through studio bouts and screaming fans. They opened their mouths to speak, but Elvis raised his hand, palm outward. "Let it breathe," he murmured, voice low and controlled. Later that night, over coffee and stale donuts, the entourage clustered around the pipe smoke haze in the lounge off the hotel lobby. Joe Esposito flipped on a small transistor radio, fishing out the news bulletin that Carson's quips were already echoing across the airwaves. The others shook their heads, muttering indignations, but Elvis sat back, fingers still tapping, eyes distant. "What are you gonna do?" Marty asked quietly. Elvis's gaze snapped back. He leaned forward, lighting a cigarette with a tremor of purpose. "Silence is louder than a mic when used right," he said. "I'll go on The Tonight Show. No scripts, no games. Maybe then they'll hear what matters, beyond the rhinestones." The room fell silent, the earlier levity extinguished. "You sure?" Alan asked, tone equal parts awe and worry. Elvis nodded, cigarette smoke curling around his shoulders like a ceremonial cloak. "I'm not calling Carson. I'm not demanding apologies. I'll just show up, and I'll speak my truth." He tapped the rhythm one last time, slower now, as though sending a heartbeat through the room. Ba-dum, ba-dum. That was the signal, the unspoken challenge that would come to be known as Elvis's quietest showdown. No roar of defiance, no blaring guitar riff, just the steady beat of dignity laid against mockery. In that moment, backstage in a dim hotel suite, he set in motion an act of measured courage that would reverberate far beyond the NBC soundstage, reshaping the narrative of a comeback and the courage of a man who chose silence over sound. Elvis Presley sat alone in his suite at the Four Seasons, the carpet muted beneath his polished loafers, a glass of bourbon untouched on the side table. The evening's earlier recording of Johnny Carson's quip still echoed in his mind. "Sixth comeback? Better get the jumpsuits out of the wash." His daughter, 7-year-old Lisa Marie, might well have been watching that on their home TV. The thought stung deeper than any heckle he'd ever faced on stage. He drained the bourbon in one slow swallow, set the empty glass down, and leaned back against the headboard. His phone lay silent, but he knew what he wanted to do. He reached for the pad and pen on the nightstand and scribbled 2 words: "Tonight Show." Then he placed the note in an envelope marked NBC Confidential and handed it to his road manager, Joe Esposito, who'd been pacing the room like a caged lion. Joe stared at the paper for a long moment, eyes flicking between Elvis's calm gaze and the door. "You're serious?" he asked, voice taut. Elvis nodded. "No scripts, Joe. No setup. I'll just answer." He tapped his finger against his chest once. "My terms." The next morning, a discreet messenger delivered the envelope to the West Coast offices of NBC. Within hours, network brass convened an emergency meeting. Headlines whispered through the industry. "Presley to appear on Tonight? King of Rock and Roll demands free reign?" The publicity department reeled. The programming head scratched his head in disbelief. They'd always assumed Elvis would snub Carson. Too many jokes at his expense. Now he was accepting and demanding zero control over the content. By mid-afternoon on April 3rd, a dark limo dropped Elvis, dressed in a tailored midnight blue jacket and trousers, at the stage entrance of NBC's Burbank lot. He stepped out without his usual entourage. No publicist, no security detail visible. Only Joe Esposito stood in the shadows, flanking him and Lisa Marie, clutching her father's hand, peeking from behind his leg. A single reporter glimpsed them and blinked before disappearing into the overflow of cameramen chasing other stories. Inside the cavernous makeup room, producers hovered like anxious sharks. Wardrobe hands unfurled bright shirts and sequined tuxedo jackets, whispering about what Elvis might wear. But Elvis strode past them, nodding calmly. He tapped Joe's arm and indicated a dark wooden chair by the makeup mirror. There he sat, pulling forward a small leather pouch to reveal a gold medallion bearing an image of Christ. He clipped it to his jacket's lapel, then closed his eyes in quiet prayer for a moment. No showmanship, just private ritual. Carson's assistant breezed in, suitcase of cue cards jangling at his side. "Mr. Presley," he said, breathless. "Mr. Carson wonders, will you be joking tonight, or—" He waved a hand toward the frenzy already gathering in the studio. Elvis opened his eyes, fixed him with a steady look. "I just answer," he said softly. "No elaboration, no rehearsal." The assistant swallowed, nodded, and backed away as Elvis rose, adjusting the medallion. In the wings, Lisa Marie perched on a director's chair, small headphones covering her ears. Through the clear side panel, she watched technicians rewire cameras, producers huddle over monitors, and the stagehands dismantle the usual set for something leaner. Her father passed her in the narrow corridor, gently ruffling her hair. "Stay safe, princess," he murmured. She pressed her glove-covered hand against his, heart pounding with both pride and fear. Under the bright studio lights, the audience buzzed. They'd been promised an exclusive Elvis appearance. Paparazzi and celebrity reporters filled the front rows. The orchestra sat poised, sheet music ready, but the bandleader glanced nervously at the cue cards marking the opening number. No one quite expected what was coming next. Backstage, Elvis took a deep breath before stepping onto the soundstage floor. The noise of cables and equipment hummed around him, but he walked forward as though crossing a silent meadow. Joe followed. Then Lisa Marie slipped behind the curtains. Carson, seated behind his desk, raised an eyebrow as the king of rock and roll strode into frame, wearing no jumpsuit, only that dark jacket and medallion. The orchestra chimed a few bars of generic theme music, but Elvis raised a hand, and it faded to a hush. "Good evening, Johnny," he said, voice calm and resonant. "Thank you for having me." Carson blinked, momentarily thrown. The audience tittered uncertainly. Elvis leaned back on Carson's desk, clasping his hands. He wore no grin, only an expression of quiet purpose. "I heard some jokes last night," he continued. "That's fine. I'm glad you're still getting laughs. But some of us listen to not just the sound, but the silence between the notes. My daughter listens, too. A ripple of tension ran through the audience as cameras clicked in rapid fire. Carson straightened, recovering his composure. "Well," he said lightly, "I suppose I'd better be careful. Or your daughter might come after me next." Elvis offered a small nod, eyes steady. "I'll be right here to answer, Johnny. No punchlines necessary." He sat back, and the studio settled into a silence far heavier than any laugh track. In that unanticipated moment, Elvis Presley reclaimed the space between words, a silent challenge that would echo long after the cameras cut away. A hush rippled through the cavernous NBC studio the instant the bandleader nodded. The house lights dimmed to a soft amber glow as stagehands whisked away the last hints of pre-show rigging. Cameras on robotic pedestals whirred into position, their lenses swiveling to capture every angle of the desk where Johnny Carson would soon meet his unexpected guest. Backstage, Elvis Presley stood beneath the dressing room mirror, the reflection of his own dark blue jacket framed in the oval glass. The fabric caught the light at the lapel, where the small medallion of Christ rested against his heart. He took a steadying breath, feeling the familiar flutter of anticipation, part fear, part resolve. A gentle tug at his hand revealed Lisa Marie, perched on a folding chair beside him, white-knuckled in her small hand. He bent to whisper one final reassurance. "Watch closely. This is for her." The curtain rose without fanfare. In its center, Johnny Carson's desk gleamed, a sleek monolith of polished walnut. Carson himself sat casually, elbow propped, tie impeccably straight. His mischievous smile broadened when the orchestra's intro faded. He leaned forward, voice warm and teasing. "Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we have a gentleman who's made more comebacks than a boomerang," he quipped. The audience tittered with recognition. "Elvis, you're back again. Is there a number you haven't tried yet?" A crisp hush followed. The studio's usual bravado seemed to waver. Elvis stepped into the circle of light, hands relaxed at his sides. He returned Carson's greeting with a quiet nod, then sank into the guest chair, legs unspanned, posture unassuming. The laughter dimmed to uneasy murmurs. Carson raised an eyebrow. "You look, well," he began, "not quite sun-bleached like Vegas." Another ripple of giggles. Elvis's face remained composed, eyes calm. He inclined his head. "Johnny," he said, voice neither lashing nor pleading, "I came here because some things need to be said, not sung." The pause stretched like a held breath. Carson's grin faltered. The audience, unsure, shifted in their seats. The studio lights seemed too bright, too exposed, as though revealing secrets better left in shadows. Carson cleared his throat. "Well, that's unexpected. I always thought the king preferred a microphone to a monologue." Elvis tilted his head, expression direct. "I'm here to answer questions. Yours, theirs, anyone's. No script, no laughter track." He paused, letting the weight of that declaration settle. "When you joke about comebacks, you mock the effort behind each one. But some of us return for a reason beyond applause." A cameraman adjusted his focus. Carson leaned back, curiosity now edged with caution. "All right," Carson said, voice softer. "Ask away, Elvis. What do you want to tell us?" Elvis allowed himself a faint smile. No showman's sparkle, but a gentle acknowledgement of the shift in tone. He looked into the camera as though addressing not the studio audience, but the millions watching at home, including a little girl in her living room. "Last night, I heard laughter," he began, words deliberate and steady. But it wasn't at me. It was at her, my daughter. She's 7. She watches her father on TV and wants to share in his joy. But when the world laughs at his return, it's her hopes they trample. A murmur rose, soft and sympathetic, as Carson's eyes narrowed in realization. "I didn't know," he said quietly. Elvis nodded. "That's the point. Jokes are easy."
Saying what you mean, meanwhile, is not. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded letter.
"A boy in Memphis wrote me after Vietnam. He'd lost his hearing on the battlefield, but he taped one of my songs and played it over and over, teaching himself to feel sound again through vibration. He wrote, 'I may never hear you, but I hear my mother smile when she listens.' I came back not to be heard by critics, but so those who need that sound can feel it where it matters." He unfolded the letter and held it gingerly between thumb and forefinger, as though it were a fragile keepsake. The camera zoomed in on the aged paper and the boy's shaky handwriting. The studio lights softened, illuminating the moment's solemn intimacy. Carson's voice trembled. "That's remarkable," he said, tone hushed. "You came back for them, not for us." Elvis folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. He rose from the chair, crossing to stand at the desk's edge. "I return for the silence between the notes," he said, gaze sweeping the audience. "Where someone listens, not just with ears, but with their heart." A profound stillness followed. No applause, no laughter, just a collective inhalation. The cameras held on Elvis's silhouette, a figure of resolute dignity against the desk's glint. Carson, usually master of ceremonies, sat humbled, his desk a simple platform beneath the weight of words that transcended humor. When the director's cue finally came, it was a whisper of white light and gentle music guiding the show onward. But in that suspended moment, Elvis's unadorned voice echoing in the hush, the audience discovered a truth no joke could capture: that sometimes the quietest return is the loudest triumph of all. The dawn after Elvis Presley's appearance on The Tonight Show arrived quietly, as though the world was still catching its breath. Los Angeles traffic hummed faintly beneath hotel windows, but inside the Four Seasons suite where Elvis slept, the air remained hushed and expectant. When Elvis finally stirred, bleary-eyed, the first thing he heard was the steady rat-a-tat of a newspaper delivery boy on the marble foyer outside his door. Downstairs in the lobby, the concierge handed him stacks of papers. The Los Angeles Times, The Hollywood Reporter, Daily News, each headline wrestling to describe something beyond scandal. "Not your usual Elvis comeback," one read. "A king's quiet rebellion," declared another. "Elvis returns and breaks the script." He flipped through the pages, noting a shift in tone. Journalists were no longer mocking rhinestone jumpsuits, but wrestling with his words, the idea that a single line of dignity could echo longer than any punchline. In the suite's small sitting area, Joe Esposito settled with a tray of coffee and croissants. He watched Elvis methodically scan the columns, eyebrows arching at selected quotes. One column by a veteran critic admitted, "I went expecting a sideshow. Instead, I witnessed a man reclaiming his narrative." Another fan letter excerpted line after line of praise, the writer describing how Elvis's measured reply on live television had given them courage to face their own bullies. "That vet from Ohio wrote again," Joe said, placing a letter before Elvis. The envelope bore a proud Purple Heart insignia stamped in cobalt blue. Elvis recognized the handwriting, block capitals, practiced by someone used to filling out military forms. He slit it open and read, "I lost my hearing on the front lines, but last night I heard your silence. It spoke to me more clearly than any song ever could. Thank you." For a moment, Elvis simply held the folded sheet, letting its weight settle in his chest. He folded it and tucked it into the breast pocket of his dark shirt, the metal of the Purple Heart pin pressing lightly into the fabric. Outside the suite, the world awaited his next move. TV offers, reunion specials, lucrative endorsements. NBC's programming chief had already called with a tempting proposition: an hour-long Elvis Presley show, free from Carson's jokes, guaranteed primetime ratings. When the conversation reached him, Elvis leaned back in his chair and let the phone ring on the desk. He could almost feel the studio exec's impatience, the offers, dollars, and fanfare dancing through the lines. Finally, he picked up. "Thank you," he began quietly. But no. The silence on the other end stretched. 5 beats, 10, before the executive coughed. "Are you sure? We can give you full creative control." Elvis set the receiver down. "I have nothing more to prove," he said, voice steady. "What matters can't be scheduled. Good night." Joe, listening beside him, let out a low whistle. "That takes guts." Elvis simply nodded, folding his hands together. In the quiet swell of early morning, the phone's weight felt like the last chain he'd broken. Later that day, they returned to Graceland. The sun was high, slanting through magnolia branches onto the whitewashed facade. Inside, Lisa Marie waited in the music room, perched on the piano bench with her notebook open, ready for her lesson. When Elvis entered, she looked up, brow knitting. He crossed the room and ruffled her hair. "Lesson later," he said. "First, a story." He sat across from her, the room's hush wrapping around them. He told her about the letters, the morning's headlines, and the NBC offer. "They wanted to give me a show," he said, voice low. "But I said no." Lisa Marie's eyes widened. "What?" He reached for the Purple Heart letter, sliding it across the piano keys so she could see the veteran's words. "Because some voices belong in the silence," he explained. "No spotlight needed." Her small fingers traced the stamped heart. "I think that's brave," she said softly. That evening, beyond the gated hedge of Graceland, Elvis walked the garden path with Lisa Marie at his side. The magnolia blooms trembled in the twilight breeze, their scent a soothing whisper. He paused beneath the old oak where he and Gladys used to sit, looking out across the field. "I wanted to prove that silence can be louder than any stage," he told her. "And I did." She slid her hand into his. "They heard you." In the hush of that moment, the echo of his quiet stand reverberated like a chord struck true. No cameras, no producers, just a man, a little girl, and the unspoken promise that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones left unsaid. The lights in the Dallas Municipal Auditorium cut from a cool blue wash to a single focused spotlight, as the band transitioned from a fiery rendition of Polk Salad Annie into the first strains of Love Me Tender. It was April of 1974, 2 weeks after his Tonight Show appearance, and Elvis Presley had settled back into his tour schedule with a new reserve in his performance. For the first time in years, his shows carried an unmistakable undercurrent of reflection, of something more than rock and roll spectacle. When the final chord of Love Me Tender dissipated, Elvis let his voice trail off, the hush rolling over the crowd like a tide. The house lights brightened, not to the usual dazzle of encore cues, but just enough for him to catch a glimpse of the faces before him, faces worn by the heat of the Texan night, lit by anticipation and that steady hum of expectation. A guitar throbbed softly in his hand as he stepped away from the mic stand and toward the piano positioned stage right. Behind him, the band leader gave a puzzled glance. This wasn't on the set list, but Elvis lifted a hand an almost imperceptible gesture, and the drums and bass quieted until only the hush remained. He seated himself at the piano, his dark shirt reflecting a single spotlight as though framing a silhouette of thought. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, inhaled deeply, and then spoke, voice low but carrying clearly across the auditorium. "There are things we can't put into words," he said. "No matter how loud the guitar, how bright the lights, some messages need to be played." A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. No one had expected this. No introduction, no light-hearted banter, only the raw sincerity in his tone. The piano keys gleamed under his fingertips as he launched into the familiar chords of "You'll Never Walk Alone," not originally part of his Vegas repertoire, but chosen tonight for its promise rather than its drama. "When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark." Every note he pressed resonated with a new depth, the gentle crest of melody underscored by the weight of his own journey. The audience sat frozen, some folding their arms like shields while others leaned forward, as if drawing strength from his every phrase. The veterans in the front row, men in uniform or draped in medals, closed their eyes, some nodding in solemn recognition of a hymn that had carried them through trenches far from home. Halfway through the bridge, Elvis's voice cracked, and the hall held its breath. He paused mid-verse, head bowed, chest heaving, as the hush swelled like a held breath. Then he continued, each syllable a testament to overcoming. "Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown." As the final chord decayed into silence, the auditorium remained motionless for a beat longer than any encore silence, far longer than any song deserved. Then, at the very back, a single man stood, uniform gleaming under the house lights, a Marine from Ohio who had lost his hearing in Vietnam. He raised a hand, then stood fully, and a solitary ripple of applause began. Tentative at first, then spreading row by row until the entire hall rose, not in ecstatic cheer, but in reverent standing ovation. No one called for an encore. They simply bore witness to the quiet triumph of a man who had spoken in chords rather than words. After the show, in the green room backstage, Elvis listened as Joe Esposito read him the Marine's second letter, the seal still unbroken. "My daughter sat beside me tonight and heard you speak through your music. I saw her eyes shine, and I realized that courage isn't loud. It's a whispered promise played from the heart." Elvis paused, tracing the letter's edge with a fingertip. He looked up at Joe, voice soft. "That's why we do this." A few days later, out of the blue, an unmarked envelope arrived in his dressing room at the Hilton. Inside was a note in Johnny Carson's neat handwriting, no signature, just these words: "I watched your silence on stage and realized I was not funny. I was small. Thank you for teaching me to listen." Elvis folded the slip of paper and let it rest on the dresser drawer next to the battered guitar pick his daughter had given him. He didn't call Carson. He didn't issue a statement. In the quiet of the empty room, he pressed his fingertips together, a private salute to the power of restraint. On tour again the next night, Elvis took the stage in Chicago and opened with "Burning Love." But as the second song began, the audience, those who had heard the Dallas broadcast on local radio or cassette tapes that circulated among fans, listened with new ears. They understood that behind the swagger, behind the voice, lay a man who demanded that the loudest moments be the ones filled with unspoken truth. In the dim hush after the show, standing under the dressing room lights, Elvis clipped the Carson note to a bulletin board above his mirror. It fluttered like a promise kept, the quietest of victories. Not in uproar, but in the hushed reverence that followed a man who dared to play the silence that mattered most. The air, backstage at the Market Square Arena that June evening, was thick with anticipation and unspoken worry. Technicians tiptoed around piles of cables, and a lone road case marked Pops sat open. Its contents: sheet music, a gold medallion, a single photograph, awaiting their owner's attention. Elvis Presley emerged from the shadows, shoulders stooped, face etched by exhaustion and pain. His once fierce vigor softened by months of relentless touring and his own frailty. He moved with purpose to the grand piano placed stage center for tonight's intimate format, a conscious retreat from fanfare to fidelity. The stage lights bloomed ivory and warm, illuminating the lacquered wood, its keys gleaming like a row of pearls. Around the piano, no band stood ready, only a single microphone on a slender stand, poised to capture every nuance of voice and breath. The auditorium seats, usually flooded with screaming fans and flashing cameras, were half empty. Those present included a scattering of local dignitaries, longtime crew members, and the veteran from Ohio whose life Elvis had touched months before. Tousled remnants of applause from the prior number still lingered in the hush. Elvis paused at the piano's lip, hand resting on the key's edge. His dark shirt clung damply to his back, and the subtle tremor in his right hand spoke of more than nerves. It hinted at the toll his body had exacted. With a measured breath, he leaned into the mic and spoke in a voice that was neither a declaration nor a whisper, but something that bridged both. This is for a friend who heard me, not through a microphone, but through the silence. He released the words into the stillness, and they settled like a benediction. No one in the audience knew exactly whom he addressed. Some guessed the Vietnam veteran. Others thought perhaps his daughter listening from home. But whatever their imaginings, each person felt the gravity of the moment. Without a note of fanfare, Elvis placed his fingers on the lower octave and began the opening chords of Unchained Melody. The melody rose with a fragile dignity, each hesitant chord underscored by the resonance of the piano's strings. His voice entered on the words, "Oh, my love, my darling, I've hungered for your touch," quavering yet steadfast. The room held its breath, every inhalation drawn through the crack in his faltering strength and resolute heart. As he continued, his voice grew steadier, each note a testament to the journey that had brought him here. The comebacks, the jests, the silences, and the promises. When Elvis reached the bridge, and time goes by so slowly, and time can do so much, his voice caught on so slowly, the tremor of emotion thrumming beneath each syllable. He paused mid-verse, eyes closed, head bowed, allowing the audience to feel the raw interval of his vulnerability. Then, gathering every shard of resolve, he resumed, driving the final chorus forward with a quiet, unwavering conviction. As the last chord hung suspended, the silence that followed was absolute. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the ever-present hum of concessions and rustling programs faded away. Then, from the back rows, the veteran from Ohio, the man who had lost his hearing in Vietnam but regained it through the vibrations of a taped Presley song, rose to his feet. His uniform gleamed under the soft lights, medals whispering of battles fought in distant lands. His single clap, firm and unhesitating, rippled through the theater until every attendee, moved beyond words, joined him in a standing ovation that felt more like a tribute than mere applause. Elvis remained at the piano, eyes still closed, letting the ovation wash over him like a benediction. As the sound swelled, his lips curved into a faint, serene smile. Then, with the gentlest of nods, he lifted his hands from the keys, rose from the bench, and walked off stage without looking back. No wave, no flourish. His departure left behind a resonance deeper than any echo of sound. 1 week later, Johnny Carson's editorial column appeared in the Los Angeles Times. In place of his usual jests, Carson wrote, "Sometimes we say things to get laughter. But that night, I heard something more powerful. Silence spoken by a man I once only knew as the king of rock and roll. He reminded me that laughter isn't the only response worth seeking." Back at Graceland, in a velvet-lined trunk of personal mementos, an unsent letter from Elvis to Carson lay nestled beside faded photographs. "Johnny, you weren't funny that night, but you reminded me, and all of us, that even when we falter, we remain human." The letter remained unopened, a private testament to a confrontation resolved not in fury, but in the eloquence of silence, Elvis's final, most poignant encore.